Solve each inequality. Write your answer in interval notation. Part A, the absolute value of x is less than or equal to 5. Now remember, when we have an absolute value expression that's less than a number, then what we solve is actually the expression where we take negative that number is less than or equal to the expression inside the absolute value, and that's less than or equal to positive the number on the right-hand side. In other words, we have negative 5 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 5. That's our solution because the expression x has been isolated, but we want to write it in interval notation. That would be brackets negative 5, comma, 5, brackets, the interval from negative to 5 to positive 5, including both endpoints. Part B, the absolute value of x is greater than 0. Recall that when we have an absolute value expression greater than another number, we set it up as the expression is less than negative the number, which of course in this case is just 0, or the expression inside the absolute value is greater than the positive number. Or in other words, x is greater than 0. Well, again, x is isolated and x is isolated, and therefore we already have solved for x, but we want to put it in interval notation. So this part of the interval would start at negative infinity and come up to 0. Or means we use union, and then it starts at 0, but not including it, going up through positive infinity. So that's our interval notation for absolute value of x is greater than 0. Part C, the absolute value of the quantity 2x plus 7 is less than or equal to negative 2. Well, I hope what stands out at you is we have an absolute value expression that's less than a negative number. But you need to remember that all expressions that come out of an absolute value have to be positive. So we have a positive is less than or equal to a negative, and that's never true. And therefore, we write no solution. Part D, the absolute value of 5x is greater than 10. Recall that when we have an absolute value expression that's greater than a number, we actually write it as the expression is less than negative the number. Or we write that the expression is greater than positive the number. So now we solve each of these independently of one another. Divide both sides by 5. That leaves us with x is less than negative 2. Or, in this case, divide both sides by 5, and that yields x is greater than 2. Now we've isolated x, so we are finished, but we need to write our answer in interval notation. So for x to be less than negative 2, that means we start at negative infinity and come up to, but do not include negative 2, and that's why we use a parenthesis in place of a bracket, or instead of a bracket. Now, the word or is a union, so we use the union symbol. For x to be greater than 2, once again, we start at 2, but do not include it, so we use a parenthesis, and then we go up through infinity. And that's the answer in interval notation. For part E, we have negative 2 times the absolute value of the expression 2 minus 5x plus 1 is less than or equal to 5. To solve this type of inequality that includes an absolute value expression, we first have to isolate the entire expression. So that means we should subtract 1 from each side. Let me show that vertically. And so we have negative 2 times the absolute value of 2 minus 5x, and that's less than or equal to 4. Now we need to divide both sides by negative 2. However, when we do this, we need to reverse the symbol. So instead of less than or equal to, it becomes greater than or equal to. So here we cancel out. Here, that's also cancels to give us -2. Now we have a situation where we have an absolute value of 2 minus 5x is greater than or equal to a negative number. Well, let's think about this. This absolute value is always going to be positive or possibly 0. But in that case, 0 or a positive number is always greater than or equal to a negative number, whether it's -2 or anything else. In other words, this is always true, so all real numbers work. When we write all real numbers as a solution in interval notation, we write from -infinity to infinity. And that's the solution in interval notation. For part F, we have the absolute value of the quantity 3 minus x is less than 5. Recall that when we have an expression that's an absolute value less than a number, the way we solve that is we have negative the number is less than the expression, which is less than the positive number. And now we solve all three parts simultaneously. That means we need to subtract 3 from each part. -5 minus 3 is -8. That's less than -x, which is less than 5 minus 3, which is 2. Now we need to multiply each side by each part by -1. Or you could think of it as divide each part by -1, which means we get 8. We need to reverse the symbol because we're multiplying or dividing by a negative number. And then we need to reverse the symbol, and we get -2. So -8 times a -1 is +8. -1 times a x is a +x, and -1 times a +2 is -2. So here's our solution. Now, normally that would be written the other way, so let me do that, where we say -2 is less than x is less than 8. So you're really just reading this one from right to left. We're supposed to put our answer in interval notation, and so the interval for this particular inequality starts but does not include -2 and goes up to but does not include 8. So the interval notation is -2, 8, not including either endpoint.